First of all, Mr. President, I want to thank my friend, the senator from Rhode Island, for two things. One, for being a constant voice on the need for us to diversify our energy sources and supplies and recognize the enormous challenge around climate change. I come from a state not too dissimilar from his in terms of we have a great deal of shoreline. We see the effects of the changing climate each and every day, where we have parts of the city of Norfolk where on a high tide, parts of the city that never before flooded on a regular basis. We have
on a sunny day.
On a sunny day. We have a church that has to regularly change its schedule of worship, not because the Lord asked them to change the schedule of worship, but because it floods on a regular basis. And let me also thank him for his comments about the tax legislation. I share his concern as somebody who feels very strongly there's a right way and a wrong way to do tax reform. Unfortunately, the product that I believe we'll be voting on next week, not only due to some of the provisions you've talked about, but will add close to $2 trillion to our debt. It does not even take care of the problems in many ways that it was supposed to solve in terms of the ability for companies to bring back profits from overseas and a way to reinvest in this country. Frankly, it exacerbates the problem where companies can further hide their profits abroad. I share your doubt whether our colleagues will join us in starting anew, but if they would, I know I would join with you and others in trying to make sure that we would do a tax reform in a fair, balanced, in a way that was fiscally responsible. So I thank you for your comments. But, Mr. President, I stand here today, though, to talk about a different subject, and that is to stand in solidarity with over 12,000 of my Virginia constituents who are students, entrepreneurs, members of our military, and also these individuals who have the distinction of being dreamers, like the nearly 800,000 dreamers across the country. These people, many of them young folks, are worried about facing deportation, and not for anything they've done wrong, but because the vast majority of these young people were brought here to this country as children many years ago. And today, unfortunately, due to no actions of their own, they're caught up in some of the worst of our nation's politics. Up until this past September, these young people were living in the United States legally under the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, or what's been called DACA. As part of this program, these young people came out of the shadows, paid a fee, went through an extensive criminal background check, and complied with all the other requirements of the DACA program. Unfortunately, Mr. President, dreamers and their families are now in a perilous situation because, unfortunately, President Trump ended the DACA program, literally putting hundreds of thousands of these young people in a state of legal limbo. And unfortunately, while a number of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle want to work through this problem, we hear that the Republican leadership has done nothing to provide that permanent solution for these hardworking, yes, young Americans. And that's who they are, folks who've lived here oftentimes for decades. This is not how the greatest country on earth should treat anyone, especially these young people who, in the most case, have only one nation that they've called home, and that's our country, the United States. Now, I'm not the only one who thinks this, Mr. President. As I mentioned, there are colleagues on both sides of the aisle who've been coming to the floor for weeks making this point. The fact is, more than 3/4 of Americans of all political stripes support a pathway to permanent legal status for dreamers. Here in the Senate, my friends Senator Lindsey Graham and Dick Durbin have introduced the bipartisan DREAM Act and have been working actively to work about its passage. In the Senate and the House, there are enough votes to pass this bipartisan legislation if leadership would only bring it to the floor. And that's not just the case here in the Senate. Just last week, my friend Congressman Scott Taylor, a fellow Virginian and a Republican, led a bipartisan group of 30 members in the House asking again the House leadership to find a legislative solution, not next year, not next month, but now. Unfortunately, to many, to me at least, it seems that some folks on the other side of the aisle would rather treat this as a political issue and a political pawn to be negotiated, probably not even this year, but at some future date. By doing so, they leave these young people in a state of limbo and really subject to a great deal of legal uncertainty. And for many of these young people, as they cycle out of the program, close to 1,000 a week, even if we come up with a legal solution, their ability to rejoin the program, reclaim their legal status, may be extinguished. The truth is, this is not just another political leverage point. Let me take a moment or two and talk about some of the folks who are affected, folks in my state, folks who I call real Virginians. I think about one, a young student from Northern Virginia, who I chose as my guest to the President's State of the Union address a few years ago. I was so impressed with her work ethic and her passion for improving the lives of others that I asked her to serve after that as an intern in my office, where she did great work serving fellow Virginians. Think about a law student I met recently in Williamsburg, who was born in England and brought here when she was just a year old. Right now, knowing it's getting close to the holidays, she's probably tucked away in some corner of the library studying for her law school exams. But she told me she wanted to get that law degree to help fellow Virginians when she graduates. I say we shouldn't stand in her way. Think about, again, a young man I met from Newport News, whose mother brought him to the United States when he was just 6 years old. Sadly, his mother passed away before he graduated from high school. But I know that when he walked across the stage of that graduation as valedictorian of his class, his mom would have been proud. And when, hopefully, if this program is renewed, when he graduates from Virginia Tech next year with a degree in engineering, he will put those skills to work. These are just a few examples about the smart, successful, young Virginians who also carry the categorization of being called dreamers. Truth is, in Virginia, we have a vibrant and growing immigrant community that contribute to all facets of life in the Commonwealth. And while I talk today about dreamers, I want to also make mention of another program who's caught up in some of these last-minute negotiations, the so-called TPS individuals, oftentimes individuals from Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, in certain cases folks who've lived in this country for decades, whose legal status are also in jeopardy. The truth is, whether they're a dreamer or someone who's been a beneficiary of the TPS program, the truth is, immigrants in Virginia are all across our community. They're doctors, caretakers, small business owners, high-tech entrepreneurs. Quite honestly, they're also our next-door neighbors. They're motivated, talented individuals who want to help to continue contributing to the Commonwealth of Virginia and to our country. And what we tell them every day that we fail to act, every day that more and more of these young people fall out of eligibility, we tell them in pretty direct ways that actually, even though they have served, studied, and work here, that at least some in this chamber don't really want them here. They'd rather take their talents, urge them to take their talents elsewhere. As somebody who's been in business longer than I've been in politics, I have to tell you, these young people are an enormous asset and urging them to leave the Commonwealth or our country is a bad business decision. As I said, unfortunately, with every day that passes, more and more dreamers face the very real and terrifying prospect of being oftentimes sent to a country they barely know or may not know at all for an offense that they were too young to even know they committed. Mr. President, that's just not right. It's not right that their lives should hang in balance as they wait and wait and wait for Congress to solve this problem. A problem that I know, if it was brought to the floor, would receive overwhelming bipartisan support. Mr. President, these young people can't wait any longer and shouldn't wait any longer. It's time to pass the DREAM Act right now. Thank you, Mr. President. With that, I yield the floor.